Hello, welcome to the conversation here on News Central Television. This is the show where we bring you the latest political updates and happenings around the continent. I am Gbenga, Aborowa.
And I am Rita, Omodia. And today, on today's edition of The Conversation, we continue with the major stories across the continent. And on Wednesday, we discussed the Zondo Commission report, which we'll be discussing and analysing deeply today. We'll also be looking at the just concluded 40th ordinary session of the AU Executive Council.
Now, the 40th ordinary session of the Executive Council of the African Union kicked off on Wednesday with leaders of the AU Commission and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA, expressing concerns over increasing security threats, including unconstitutional changes of government and infectious diseases such as COVID-19 across the continent. Addressing the Executive Council, chairperson of the AU, Musa Faki Mahamat, said the continent had been affected by a string of conflicts that destabilized large numbers of people. Peace and security have been seriously threatening many regions of the continent, with increasing military coups, interstate conflict, and expansions of murdering groups in many African states. Chairperson blamed the deficient political, economic, and social governance across the continent for the increasing insecurity problems. He said the resurgence and unconstitutional change of government are dangerously affecting the continent as the continent is battling with COVID-19 pandemic and the deteriorating climate change. The Executive Council meeting, which brings together foreign ministers of the African countries at the AU headquarters in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, for the first time since the COVID-19 pandemic, is expected to consider draft agenda of the 35th ordinary session of the AU Assembly, slated to be held from February 5th to 6th.
And there are a lot of expectations for the African Union. And joining us live on the conversation for this episode to discuss this is Collins Nweke, a Global Affairs Analyst. Thank you so much for joining us on the conversation.
My pleasure to be with you on the conversation once more.
So we're looking at some of the highlights of the 40th Executive Ordinary Session of the AU Executive Council. To you, what were some of the major highlights?
Well, the major highlight for me is the fact that the AU, it's not like it is new, but the fact that they have weighed in more than ever before in the increasing insecurity in Africa. And the spate of, coup d'etat is something that I believe, deserved the sort of attention that it needs. One can only hope that, unlike in previous situations where such, assemblies end up just as a talking shop, that this time around, very concrete steps will be taken towards, putting a stop to this coup mayhem. As a matter of fact, some have actually called it, coup endemic, in Africa. So I am looking forward to seeing that. But more importantly, there have been a watch list of reforms that need to take place within the African Union. And one is expecting that the reforms unit that was established in September 2017 will finally be given sufficient teeth to be able to, do what it's got to do in terms of making the AU more fit for purpose than it has so far been. These are, my expectations, and the fact that indeed, they have touched on all of these means that the business is going on very well. But the main thing, of course, is the summit that will be kicking off, I believe, on Sunday, the 6th of February.
And talking about that summit that will be taking place on Sunday, a vote is going to be held, and the African Union is quite divided on the issue of Israel. President Cyril Ramaphosa is leading a continental campaign to cancel Israel's status as an accredited observer at the African Union this weekend. And why is it so? And why does South Africa not want Israel as an observer in the African Union?
I believe that President Ramaphosa appears to be listening to sentiments being expressed by civil society organizations, not just in South Africa, but across the world. I believe also that President Cyril Ramaphosa has been very, very attentive to the shifting political grounds in the United States of America, the strongest ally of Israel, where whatever Israel did was okay for the United States. They will continue to support it. Now, in the last, several months, we are beginning to experience some sort of shifts in that position, which means that finally, Israel, a lot more people, a lot more countries are telling Israel that they need to respect the rights of the Palestinians. They need to stop the draconian approach to, their coexistence with Palestinians, and that the imperialist activities in Palestine has got to stop. So that is also resonating now in Africa. Now, those who favor Israel, the new status that the AU has given to Israel and want to deepen more collaboration, they're looking more at the economic benefits that Israel brings to the table. But beyond that, Israel is more and more turning out to be a bully of the neighborhood. And what Ramaphosa is doing is actually saying, enough of this, we've got to take a few steps backwards as a continent and, do things better.
Collins, just to quickly follow up on that point, we do remember what South Africa went through in its apartheid states. The Organization of African Unity, as it was known there, was fully behind sanctions against the apartheid regime. And what is happening between the Israelites and Palestinians is reminiscent of this. And I guess that's why President Ramaphosa has been a vocal critic of this. So which way do you think the vote will go on Sunday? Do you think, because of the economic interest that Israel brings, will they be able to keep their observer status at the African Union, or should their moral conscience of Africans prevail and Israel won't get the vote to stay in the AU?
Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa has been working around the clock. I believe that a significant number of people, a significant number of his contemporaries in Africa are listening to him. A few appear to be telling him the hard truth, which is that, yes, we hear your argument loud and clear. We also understand your background as somebody who has experienced apartheid, firsthand, and indeed you are very, very jilty about that happening in other parts of the world. We know that Palestine is a friend of South Africa. However, at this point in time, the economic benefit of Israel becoming and remaining a part of the Security Council of the AU is something that they need. It is an imperative of the time, and so they are willing to keep that observer status. Now, I think the difference is going to be made by just a few votes, because yes, there are those who are not looking beyond the economic benefit, but there is also significant number. But I think ultimately, what makes this whole situation a bit complicated for Ramaphosa is the fact that African leaders don't quite care about what their electorates think about. Because in other climes, I believe that the arguments of Cyril Ramaphosa is one that will resonate with the electorates in different countries. And so their leaders are want to indeed listen. I have to have the crystal ball to be able to tell you for certain
the outcome
where the vote will go. Unfortunately, I haven't got that, Gbenga.
Thank you very much, Collins.
Collins, I'll take you up from what you said there. You talked about them not caring enough about what the electorates think about. And if you would agree, it's been a turbulent year for Africa. Tens of thousands have been killed in wars in the Horn of Africa. Countries are falling back on the military rule and struggled with flood transitions and Islamist insurgency. Do you believe the AU has the capacity to handle all this? Because some critics will call them a people of glorified African governments. Do you believe so?
Well, the AU does have very major challenges. Institutional, structural, lack of focus, to name very few. And now what that means is that it has translated in a situation where there is a poor decision-making process, accountability is nowhere to be found, and so on and so forth. So these are the sort of challenges that are actually hampering some alignment in positions on how to deal with certain issues. For example, the spate, combating the spate of coup d'etat in Africa. So it is a major challenge. One will expect that they will be more coordinated and that they will be more preventive in their approach in terms of being more proactive rather than the reactive measures that they are taking now. So that is the expectation of a cross-section of the populace.
Now, Collins, over the last 14 months, Ethiopia's civil war has killed tens of thousands and displaced an estimated 2 million. Ironically, the African Union headquarters is in Ethiopia. What efforts are being made by the AU in securing a ceasefire in Ethiopia?
Well, their efforts, as a matter of fact, cannot be written off as being insignificant. But again, I will bring us back to some of the vices bedeviling the African Union in terms of lack of coordination. I believe also that they have not been proactive enough in preventing some of the escalations that actually took place in Ethiopia and indeed other parts of of Africa, and hopefully with a more united voice, they will favor diplomacy as they obviously do, but be more pragmatic in terms of the solution that they put on the ground. As a matter of fact, the Tigrans cannot be written off just like that. I believe that somehow the AU should be able to facilitate a situation where the government and the Tigran forces meet each other somewhere in the middle.
Okay. All right, thank you so much, Collins. You said so much things about the expectations of the African Union. And now join us live on the conversation is Marjolaine Ajaltahi. She will also be discussing with us on the African Union and, of course, so many things to expect from them. Thank you so much for joining us on the conversation at this time. Marjolaine.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. All right, so we've been discussing the 40th ordinary session of the Economic Council of the African Union, and our other guest, Collins, talked about so much expectations and the highlights of the meeting. So for you, there have been criticisms on the AU's administration. What do you think are some of the challenges that are affecting the African Union?
Well, precisely, I can only talk about the case of the African Union involvement in the Sudan in the last 3 years. And since the overthrow of President Bashir, the African Union was involved as part of the negotiation team to broker a deal between the military and the civilians. That was in 2019. Shortly after that, about 6 weeks after, there was a massacre in Khartoum, after which the whole political process of negotiation has collapsed. At that point, the African Union made a very strong statement against the coup d'etat, with which the Sudanese people felt that the African Union did actually represent their wishes and expectations as an African organization. Unfortunately, shortly afterwards, about 3 weeks after, and that brings us to July 2019, the African Union seemed to be more and more leaning in the negotiations toward the military side. That was very unfortunate because, like I said, we believe that Sudan at that particular moment was in the path for a proper democracy and civilian state. So kind of twisting the people's wishes and leaning more to the military side was very unfortunate. Anyway, that the African Union that deal was done, and we had a transitional government, which was a combination of the African Union, of the military and the civilian partners, which collapsed in October 2021 with a full military coup d'etat. Well, now here is our real disappointment, and if you can say, a divorce between the African Union and the peoples of the Sudan, the millions of peoples of the Sudan, as you're showing them in your screen now. And that is, the African Union was never strong enough in its condemnation of the military coup d'etat. To start with, they never actually called it a military coup d'etat. I mean, the constitution, which the African Union have overseen, has been lifted. The prime minister was arrested. Several ministers are arrested. The killings and shootings are a daily occurrence in the Sudan for civilian demonstrators. I mean, what more military coup d'etat could it be? At the top of it, there are three generals, not three generals. The whole Sovereign Council is more or less generals, military generals and militiamen. That is defined as a military coup d'etat. Then they still are trying for the second time to broker a deal between the military and the civilian. Now, the problem here is the fact that brokering a deal with the civilian and the military is just another way of saying that of an exit for the military from any form of accountability, from any form of giving up power, and basically buying time for the military. The leadership of the military and the militia in the Sudan has proven again and again and again that they are irrelevant in the Sudan. They are opposed by so many people, and therefore, I just really don't understand when people say broker a deal between, and not only broker a deal, like I said, without any conditions on the military side, just completely without any conditions, calling for a power sharing between the civilians and the military. And I would say it's in a way, like we rightly say, any call for this kind of negotiations is in a way legitimization of the military coup d'etat, a legitimization and giving the life kiss to the military leadership, which is totally, entirely rejected. Like last time in 2019, the civilian part main role was to give a facelift to the military. All the power, the military power, the economic power are in the hands of the military, whereas Dr. Hamdok was a kind of the acceptable civilian face. He didn't sit with any power, any real power.
Okay, Dr. Elto here, I would like, sorry to interrupt you there, I would like to bring in Collins to respond to this in a different light. Collins, Dr. Elto here just painted a picture of the African Union being not too hard on Sudan and having soft responses to the coup in October. Now, the African Union's response to the Chadian situation too, it's kind of similar. Following the death of long-term leader Idris Deby, some observers have perceived the decision not to suspend Chad. As the Chadian constitution says, after the death of the president of the National Assembly should take place. That didn't happen. His son assumed power. I mean, Chad is not a monarchy. So all these things happening in Sudan and African Union's response, does it undermine the organization's credibility, African Union's credibility? What are your thoughts, Collins?
Really, indeed, undermines the credibility of the African Union. All of these, omissions and commissions. Now, I'd like to refer to two specific incidents. Happily, it is not playing out now because, in the run-up to the election of a new chairman, you will recall that in 2010, Gaddafi, who chaired the African Union, was actually, and again, very important to mention, he was then the biggest, financial supporter of the African Union. He was making very, very clear moves to elongate his chairmanship by 1 year. And what was his reason? He needed more time to accomplish his vision of United States of Africa. And within the African Union, he found some support. Now, let us also look at the fact that al-Bashir of Sudan almost became the chairperson of the African Union at the time when Darfur was in tatters. And we all know the role that the man was playing there. But for the intervention of the likes of Amnesty International, who said, listen, if this ever happens, the AU should very well, consider itself absolutely undermined by the AU. It took, some divine intervention for al-Bashir not to become, the chair of the African Union. So you see, I made reference to these two instances as a matter of fact to actually line up behind the points that Gwendoline is making, because obviously the African Union appears highly compromised. And until we have a situation where national interest is broadened by respective African leaders to include the interest of the entire African bloc, until that happens, until people begin to align their interests, with those of Africa, in terms of this integration, I believe that these sort of things will continue to happen. But one can only hope that when they sit back at home in their solitary confinement, just by themselves, they will think back at the expectations and the visions of the founding fathers of the Organization of African Union that became AU, when they said that African integration, Pan-Africanism is very, very important, and that is the agenda. At the moment, that appears to be happening in very funny ways, and that can be condemned.
Now, Collins, while there's a lot of hope and expectations for this extraordinary summit, we know that the African Union's Agenda 2063 is Africa's blueprint and master plan for transforming Africa into a more global powerhouse for the future. Do you feel the AU is on the right track to achieving this, and is it even achievable?
Well, I do not see why it is not achievable if they can be a bit more purposeful. At the moment, are they purposeful? Partially. I say partially because in 2017, when Paul Kagame was appointed, to lead the reform process, he swung into action, immediately, appointing very credible advisors, and then leading to the reforms unit that was established within the AU, and then, the leadership appointed. They have been hard at work, and the most critical of all that they need to do is financial independence of the AU. At the moment, it is so deeply dependent on partner funding to be able to do what it has to do. And what do we say? He who pays the piper takes the tone. So you see, until that happens, and I believe that is something that they need to prioritize, I believe also that the Agenda 2063 will make all the sense in the world the moment they realize that, yes, we have a whole lot of nagging issues, but our focus have got to be fewer. We can't take on all the challenges in one go, because trying to do that as the African Union has tried to do in the last decade, increasingly in the last 5 years, has meant that nothing is so effectively and efficiently done. So yes, it is achievable, but African Union leadership has got to be more purposeful to make it, achieve its goal.
Now, Dr. El-Tahir, there's a widespread view that the African Union and its bureaucracy are glorified servants of African government. Some have even gone ahead to call it Old Boys Club, because you see a lot of governments that are not Democrats. You see constitutional changes to extend their term limits. The African Union doesn't condemn this. They just sit back and watch and still welcome them to Addis Ababa for summits. And what do you make of this? Is this an accurate picture of what the African Union is? Is it more like an old boys club?
Well, it is certainly not a good club, and possibly an old boys club. It is not just bureaucracy. Bureaucracy could mean inefficiency or delays in taking actions or something. What is missing and what we are lacking in Sudan is the political will. The African Union does not have a political will. The African Union is not an independent organization. The African Union does not have in its heart the interest of the peoples of the Sudan or the development of the Sudan or the rule of law in the Sudan. And I give you a very small but very telling example of the failure of the African Union in being taken seriously as an organization which advocates for the rule of law in Africa. The former President Bashir, like Mr. Collins have mentioned, is indicted by the ICC for criminal charges, and he was a sitting indicted president, very welcomed in several African summits while he is indicted. He has been sitting in jail for 3 years now. The African Union have not made a single statement, let alone a serious attempt to hand that former president to the ICC. And in that, by following that, by putting political pressure on the Sudanese government, on the international community to hand over Bashir to the ICC, it gives a very strong signal that genocides are not acceptable in Africa, they are not forgiven, and would have been an action that would have put the African Union in a place of a serious organization when it comes to combating things like genocide, coup d'etat, military dominance in Africa, etc. The second example, again, Mr. Collins have touched on it, and that is Israel. It is, it really is, I would say, pathetic. Last year, the military has single-handedly agreed on normalization of relations with Israel. Now, first and foremost, Sudan was never in war with Israel in order to call it a normalization. Yet again, it wasn't the people's decision. There wasn't a parliament. There was no discussion. It was the military basically cutting a deal with Israeli intelligence, and they got what they received. Currently, in the demonstrations after the coup d'etat, there has been several trips between the Israeli security to Khartoum. Just less than 2 weeks ago, there was a delegation, and equally the military goes to Tel Aviv very often. What we received from that is something called skunk water, which is kind of colored waters used to disperse demonstrators. Yes. Now, according to a BBC report from 2015, these skunk waters have been used and against two groups in Israel. They are used against Palestinians, and they are used against Black, Jewish, and immigrants, African immigrants, to disperse demonstrations. That is according to the BBC report from 2015. Now, these waters are produced in one factory only all around the world, and that factory is in Israel. These waters are used 3 times between October and January to disperse Sudanese demonstrators.
Now,
it is very...
Marjolaine, yeah? You've talked so much about the lopsidedness of the African Union, but do you feel sanctions now will form as a major deterrent measure? Because we've seen ECOWAS deliver so many sanctions on most of these countries that coup d'etat has been successful. And if we look at the issue of Burkina Faso and so many other countries that despite the sanctions, we still have coup d'etat going on, do you feel sanctions right now are overpassed, that we should be looking past the issue of sanctions, or probably the African Union should also be putting out more sanctions on such countries?
No, I don't think that, and we do not, I don't think at all that sanctions against the country only harm the people. However, individual sanctions, sanctions for companies owned by these individuals, this will limit their influence and will limit their power. But sanctions against the country, the military, the corrupt military always finds a way of ensuring that they have enough financial and economic resources, including after over 20 years of sanctions in Sudan. They didn't come out of that poor or...
Marjolaine? Okay, we seem to have lost her.
I think we've lost Dr. El-Tahir. Back to you, Collins. Just before we begin to wrap up our conversation, what part, I mean, the African Union is 20 years old. It's precursor, the Organization of African Unity is quite older. So it's been quite some time that African countries have come together in order to prefer African solutions to African problems. What part of the African Union do you think needs a reform, and how can they better project themselves in the continent in being, I mean, a continental body to addressing some of the issues on the continent?
Oh yeah, sorry, I lost you for a moment, but I believe the question is, you know, where the concentration should be in the reform process that, you know, African Union is going. Yeah, okay. Well, as a matter of fact, I think the most urgent is institutional realignment. That's one. I believe that it is important for the African Union to lead some sort of, you know, mindset realignment politically, in terms of, you know, the African leaders, because at this moment it does look like the individual nation states of Africa appear to have their own national interest. Sometimes they mention sovereignty as a reason for some of the things they do. For example, the obnoxious coup that we have, you know, seen all across Africa. In the past 10 years, we've had about 40 or maybe even 43 coups. Of course, majority of them failed, but for Christ's sake, 11 succeeded. Now, African Union has no business talking with the coup leaders, and I think the way is not, you know, sanctions per se, but complete isolationism of, you know, the coup plotters. But you see, within the union, you did call it, you know, an old boys association. I call it a club of tired old men. So they have got to give up those national interests, or at least expand that national interest that is, you know, at the forefront of what they do, and look more at the you know, global interest of Africa. And I think by the time they do that, their emphasis of on sovereignty, their national sovereignty, their national interest, and all of that will.
Collins, can you hear us? Okay, all right. That was Collins Nweke. Thank you so much for sharing so much light on the expectations for the African Union. And he also focused on expanding national interest, in which the African Union looks at the expectations and, of course, what the electorates need for a better African continent. And we also know that the theme for AU for 2022 is building resilience and nutrition in the African continent. So we look forward to see what's going to happen at this extraordinary summit that kicked off on Wednesday. We also like to thank Marjolaine El-Tahi, who joined us also on discussing the expectations of the African Union. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be looking once again at the Part 2 report of the Zondo Commission. Do stay tuned. Welcome back. You're still on to the conversation on News Central. And earlier on, we discussed the AU summit going on and some of the expectations that people would need from the African Union. And right now, we go over to the second part of the conversation, where we'll also be looking deeply into the reports of the Zondo Commission. Now, the presidency on Tuesday, February 1, received the second part of the state capture report. Part 2 of the report of the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture released on Tuesday focused on two state-owned companies, that is the Transnet and Denel. It details the financial and operational decline of both companies, which became targets of state capture. The handover was done behind closed door at the union buildings, unlike the first part, where the president accepted the report live on TV. It comes almost a month after the first installment was handed over to the president and made public. The commission, which sat for 4 years, had testimony relating to how the country's public institutions were infiltrated, looted and hollowed out during former President Jacob Zuma's tenure as head of state. And as required by a ruling of the High Court, the president will submit the commission's report to Parliament by 30th June with an indication of its intentions with regards to implementation of the Commission's recommendations.
Now, joining us in the conversation for this episode is Sanusha Naidu, the Senior Research Associate based with the Institute for Global Dialogue. Thank you very much for joining us on the conversation, Sanusha.
Okay, so
good evening, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us, Naidu. So we're looking at the report, and the report recommended that law enforcement agencies conduct further investigations with a view to the possible prosecution of former transnet officials involved in criminal or other violations of the Public Finance Management Act. Now, the officials to be involved, or rather to be prosecuted, according to the report, included the CFO, former CFO, that's Anand Singh, former Chief Procurement Officer Tamsana Gianni, and former CEO Siyambonga Gama. Can you further explain their complicity in the transnet dealings?
So what has happened with this second installment of the report is that it details the level at which these individuals are implicated in state capture, in the way that they've conducted their relationship to the board, in terms of the contracts that they were signing, in terms of the kinds of issues that they were putting forward, and at times misleading both the parliament and, of course, misleading and contravening the Public Financial Management Act, which is about how many, it sets the rules around how you procure. And so in the second report, in the second volume of the report, you find that there's, like in the first one, there's a lot of detailed information, and it uses particular transactions to highlight the level of complicity in misleading and deliberately using a strategy to move money or to basically shift money from the public coffers into private hands. And all of this means that you had auditing companies, like one of the companies that does remain quite a controversial company right now as a result of the release of the two volumes, is Bain and Company, a UK kind of branding company that was involved in the branding with the Guptas, and involved with the branding of some of the way in which the Guptas were linking up with the state and with these entities that are now implicated in the two volumes that have been released. And so this is what it's really about. When you look at the recommendations, and these volumes are quite intense in terms of information overload. They're very intense when it comes to detail. They're very intense when it comes to detailing and sketching out what this meant for state capture. So when you look at some of the recommendations, particularly when you read the volume 1 and you look at what Acting Chief Justice Zondo says in terms of the role that the former CEO of ESCOM played in having these breakfast shows with a Gupta-led company called TNA, he says that this is basically a complicit relationship. And the recommendations he makes from those findings, he says, well, you got to have further investigation, because we must bear in mind that the Zondo Commission, or the Commission of Inquiry, not the Zondo Commission. Remember, the appointment of acting Justice, Chief Justice Zondo, was only after the Commission of Inquiry was established. But the terms of reference of that commission is that it does not have prosecutorial authority, which then means that you have to go back to the prosecuting authorities or the structure in the country, particularly with the National Prosecuting Authority, and you have to say to the prosecuting authorities, now you've got to take this even further.
Thank you very much, Tinashe. Now, the Zondo Commission of Inquiry report has just opened the level of rot in South African state institutions, and I'm just wondering if the extant laws in South Africa are inadequate, because why did he have to get to this report before arrest made and recommendations for people that clearly violated the trust of the South African people to be indicted?
I mean, it's very important to understand. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this is that this commission comes at the recommendation of the previous public protector, Thuli Madonsela, who wrote, based out of her Nkandla report, Living in Comfort. And the Nkandla report was also linked to money that was used, state money that was used in order to refurbish the former president's homestead in northern KwaZulu-Natal, his private home. Now, what's important here is that the Commission of Inquiry then starts to look at this. So it's establishing the terms of reference. At that point in time, when we look at where we were 4 years ago, or where we were 5 or 6 years ago, or 7 years ago, or what some of what the president of our current president said when he appeared before the commission, saying the 9 lost years. When you look at that time, this commission didn't exist. The level of corruption, the level of misappropriation of public finances for personal and basically for personal gain and leverage. Basically, we didn't have this. We didn't have all of this evidence. It may be not evidence that is as deep and as broad and consolidated, but we were picking up anecdotal. We were picking up this, and we were hearing about things that were happening with state contracts. We were hearing about boards. There were different academics that were giving their own kind of project-related work, research. We had investigative journalism. That's a key. The investigative journalists started to talk about this and they were a key driver of also assisting how this commission had gone around its work. But the problem was finding the whistleblowers. And we know that in South Africa, like the world over, whistleblowers are essentially a very, very threatened group of people. They don't necessarily have the protection of the authorities that are in power, whether we're sitting in South Africa, whether we're sitting in Nigeria, whether we're sitting in Kenya, or wherever else in the world. And I think that is why this commission was established. And I think the key question when you read the commission report, the first report and the second, is the question that they had to answer is, has the evidence presented before us established state capture? And the answer to that question, as you read towards the end of the 800 plus pages in the first volume, and of course towards the end of the second one, you see that the findings that the acting Chief Justice makes is that it's yes. There was a lot of anecdotal evidence coming out. There was things like he said, she said, they said.
Yeah,
for example,
Naidu,
the former
Naidu,
Deputy Finance Minister.
Talking about that,
Sorry,
Naidu.
can I just finish this point?
All right.
Yeah.
Go on, Naidu.
Yeah. So like the former Deputy Finance Minister, he made a very important submission. In fact, he was the one that also spoke about, I'm talking about Jonas, Mcebisi Jonas. He actually said he was offered $600 million by the Guptas to basically flout the rules of procurement. So I think this is why this commission was established. But of course, it was established with not prosecutorial powers. So this means that there's an added layer now of basically trying to find those that are prosecuted. But just to add an addendum to this, if you look at some of the smaller prosecutions that are taking place for those middlemen, for those that are to pay back, it is happening. But I think it's about the bigger names, the bigger personalities, and the big wigs that are all involved between party and state.
Now, talking about the bigger personalities, the State Capture report described as fiction, while ANC Secretary General Gwede Mantashe's version that he supported Gama because of the fact that they were a white minority. But you would also know that Gama now, when he said that he was actually with that there was actually no white minority in the list, and this somehow contradicts what he said, that because of the white minority, that was why he supported Gama. So do we see a bit of contradictions in what he's saying there?
So taking that you're referring to Mr. Gwede Mantashe and his testimony before the commission. Yeah, I think what we found there is very much a need to try and soften what were some of the levels of knowledge that people had about what was going on at the time. Even I'm waiting for the third volume to come out, because that will now deal with the current president's testimony before the commission and how that's going to be interpreted. Because as much as the current president had admitted to questions around the inadequacies and the challenges of cadre deployment and giving promises that they'll probably deal with it, it is basically a challenge for internal party members, particularly those that want to see the party as still being that cohesive unit. Unfortunately, it's no longer there. It's more or less just completely fragmented. So I think what you're raising in terms of Mr. Mantashe and his response to the way in which Mr. Gama's appointment took place, again, there's this disconnect. And I'm not sure whether that is about an infringement of the office that you held, because he wasn't a member of the cabinet at the time. But at the same time, it's a question of
Naidu,
what does the party do?
All right. Thank you so much, Naidu, on discussing deeply about the Zondo Commission report. Thank you so much for joining us on the conversation.
Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And this is where we draw the curtains on the conversation for today. Our first guest, Mr. Collins Nweke, joined us to talk about the 40th Ordinary Summit of the African Union. And we just had Sanusha Naidu to discuss the part 2 of the Zondo Commission report. And that's it on the conversation today. I'll see you all on Friday. I'm Gbenga, Aborowa.
I am Rita, Omodia. Thanks for staying tuned.